Well, what a beautiful, beautiful day to be back in Galway. Are we able to stand this heat? That's what I wonder. You know, can we cope with it? Yesterday, I gather, you didn't have this nice cooling, and it was pretty hot in here. But I'm delighted to be here. It was actually the Ballina connection that encouraged me to accept the invitation to give a keynote speech at our Ocean Wealth Summit 2018. So my thanks and my congratulations to Peter Heffernan and his team for putting this impressive summit together. I remember well as a child growing up beside the River Moy, knowing it was the finest salmon river in Ireland, watching the fishermen with the nets catching the salmon, and being very proud of my town. But then that's nothing to do with the oceans. So this invitation required me to look more carefully at Goal 14 of the 2030 agenda on conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, and then link that to my work on climate justice. And the task is not difficult, because those whose lives depend directly on the oceans tend to be very vulnerable to climate change, but not to be big contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, as you know, we all depend on the oceans. They cover 71% of the Earth's surface and are essential for making the planet livable. Rainwater, drinking water, and climate are all regulated by ocean temperatures and currents. Over 3 billion people depend on marine life for their livelihood. And let's remember that oceans absorb 30% of all carbon dioxide produced by humans. So it's very foolish of us not to protect the oceans. Yet, we know that there has been a 26% increase in acidification since the Industrial Revolution. In addition, 30% of marine habitats have been destroyed, and 30% of the world's fish stocks are overexploited. We've all become aware of the problem of plastics. I gather that every minute, about 15 tons of plastic are released into the oceans, ending up killing whales, killing other fish and seabirds, and indeed becoming part of our own food chain. The world has begun to wake up to this crisis. In June 2017, under the presidency of Fiji, the UN General Assembly held its first Oceans Conference, and 193 countries made a series of voluntary commitments in the outcome document, Our Ocean, Our Future, Call for Action. And I think this Galway conference is very much part of that call for action. So what's the link with climate justice? For me, it stems from the injustice of the impacts of climate change and the resultant undermining of human rights, which motivates my own work on climate justice. The impacts of this change are felt hardest by those people who've done the least to cause the climate crisis. Recurrent drought in the Sahel in Africa, intense flooding in South Asia, more intense tropical cyclones in the South Pacific, sea level rise affecting coastal communities all over the world, and particularly the small island states. The people and communities on the front lines of climate change have benefited least from our traditional development paradigm, and as such have the least capacity to recover from the shocks and the changing climate brings. This is unacceptable and must be remedied, starting with a robust implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. Let's just consider for a moment migration in the context of climate change. We must recognize that the world is grossly underprepared for a situation where adaptation fails and people are displaced due to the impacts of climate change. The reaction to the current refugee crisis in Europe is falling desperately short of a robust and people-centered response, and as a result, people are being denied their rights. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It aggravates poverty, food insecurity, water scarcity. It impacts on people who live in already vulnerable circumstances due to poverty, gender, or race, and exacerbates existing socioeconomic inequalities. The fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change notes that ocean acidification is set to continue for all their model scenarios up to the end of the 21st century. Some 540 million people depend on fisheries and aquaculture as a result of protein and income, as a source of protein and income. Increased acidification will make the oceans much less hospitable to many forms of marine life and put increased strain on the lives of millions of the poorest fisherfolk. As many commentators have noted, the current migration crisis is a forewarning of what is to come. A growing world population and increasing resource scarcity, coupled with rising global temperatures, will amplify the pre-existing drivers of migration. It would be very wise to take a long-term view when responding to the current crisis, as it's likely to be the start of a longer-term strategy to manage human mobility. I've seen figures of the possible displacement of people because of climate change somewhere in the region of 150 million to 200 million by 2050. And 2050 is not very far away. Migration is a journey by people from one place to another to settle temporarily or permanently in a new location. All journeys have a start, a beginning, and an end. All journeys have a reason, a purpose. And the best journeys are well-planned, complication-free, and safe from their beginning to the final destination. The fundamental tools for ensuring that human migration is a safe journey are human rights. Human rights ensure dignity, and to be successful, migration must be with dignity. Human rights, from procedural rights, such as participation and access to information, to substantive rights, such as the rights to food, water, shelter, and life itself, are the safeguards we enjoy as individuals when we move voluntarily or as a last resource. Recently, I had the pleasure to interview another former president, the former president of Kiribati, which is a small set of atolls in the Pacific. Anatone Tong was a two-term president of Kiribati, and I interviewed him for a storytelling book on climate justice, which will come out in September, October. He spoke passionately about the existential threat posed to his people and their culture by climate change. Rising sea levels threaten to submerge the islands of Kiribati. The reserves of potable water on his islands are being contaminated by saltwater intrusion. Shortly before our talk, a king tide caused heavy flooding across the islands, inundating a hospital and causing panic and distress. The people of Kiribati are slowly coming to terms with the increasing likelihood of displacement. President Tong is doing everything he can to avoid this eventuality. He's even discussed the possibility of floating the islands, getting some way of raising them above the water so that the people can stay there as a sovereign country. However, he's adopted a policy of migration with dignity by buying land in Fiji, a neighboring island but very far away in the Pacific, so that if his people do have to leave their homeland, they will be equipped with skills that will allow them to integrate more easily into the receiving communities there. And I sometimes think, when I was Uachtaráin na hÉireann here, there were many challenges facing our small island state at the time, but I never had to consider the evacuation of the country, that we would not have a future as a people, that we would not be members of the United Nations anymore, that we would not be sovereign anymore. And if you think back, when Eleanor Roosevelt and her commission drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it would have been for them unimaginable that whole countries might go out of existence because of human-induced climate change. The same applies to the 1951 Refugee Convention and even its 1967 protocol. The governments that drew up these agreements would never have imagined that climate change would trigger the displacement and migration of people, so they're not covered by the Refugee Convention or its protocol. So we must uphold the dignity of men and women on the front lines of climate change by insisting there are no inevitable victims. The only way to avoid the type of last resort migration from the Republic of Kiribati and the millions of other people around the world made increasingly vulnerable as warming increases is to act now to phase out carbon emissions by 2050. We need to plan for a safe world by staying well below 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial standards and work hard not to go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And some of you may have seen in the newspapers a leaked report of the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is due to come out in October. What was leaked was a draft sent to governments, and it is causing quite a lot of, quite a stir at the moment among governments. As it's a leaked report, I don't propose particularly to refer to it, but there will be a lot of discussion about how we're going to achieve a safe world for our children and grandchildren by staying at a level that's safe for people and what that will mean in real terms. And I was saddened to hear our Taoiseach saying in the European Parliament some time ago that unfortunately Ireland is something of a laggard on climate change and we have to do something about it. And I think there is a certain feeling that something is being done, but I still feel we have to go a lot further. Of course, the impacts of climate change are already being felt. Recently, the United Kingdom Met Office announced that the global average surface temperatures have already passed 1 degree of warming. And as global temperatures increase, so too does the need for adaptation. The UN Environmental Programme estimates that the global cost for adaptation in developing countries will rise to as much as $300 billion per year by 2050. Migration within a country or across borders can be an effective adaptation strategy, and these strategies must be understood and planned for as part of adaptation planning as envisaged in the Cancun Adaptation Framework. And now countries are talking about if mitigation isn't being done sufficiently urgently by the rich countries that are polluting more, and indeed the big emitters like China and India, and if adaptation is so costly and isn't actually being effective, then we have to talk about loss and damage. And are we prepared to talk about loss and damage for those countries and those peoples that are so affected by climate change? I want to come down to the individual level in my concluding remarks. One individual action we can all take is to reduce our use of plastics, especially single-use plastics. And happily, this has at last become a topical and urgent issue, both here in Ireland and globally. Recently, I traveled back to Rwanda for a forum on African leadership. And as the plane which took us from Amsterdam to Kigali landed, the pilot welcoming us to Kigali warned us to leave any plastic bags on board, as we could risk a heavy fine or imprisonment in Rwanda. In neighboring Kenya, the Minister for Environment, Judy Wakungu, has introduced a huge fine for anyone in possession of a plastic bag as of last August. So developing countries are trying. But the real problem with plastics is in the industrialized world, and we need to do more. Films like the BBC's Blue Plastic 2 help, and I didn't realize when I prepared this speech that, in fact, after our panel discussion with my distinguished fellow panelists, the producer of that film, Orla Doherty, who's sitting here in the front row, will be speaking, so I'm sure she'll say much more about that. But that film, I remember, highlighted horrors such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And it's also impressive to see what Sian Sutherland from A Plastic Planet is doing, opening the world's first plastic-free supermarket aisle in the Netherlands, which features over 1,000 plastic-free products to show that we can survive without plastic wrapping. And I'm also proud of what one of my colleagues in my foundation, she's now our special advisor, Dr. Tara Shine, is doing in her native Kinsale. She's making Kinsale plastic-free with a number of her colleagues and friends. So we can all do something, and I could say a lot more about what we could all do, but specifically in this context, let's commit to the example that was given some years ago by Wangari Maathai. I hope that name resonates with at least some of you here. She was a Nobel Peace Laureate, a wonderful woman, a mentor of mine, in fact, who planted thousands of trees in her native Kenya, stood up to the government in trying to remove parks and things in Kenya. And she also urged us all to reduce, reuse, recycle. And when I think about those words, reduce, reuse, recycle, I remember growing up that we actually mended things. I can sew buttons on, and I can do a bit of darning, and I know what it is, but I don't do it anymore because we throw away. We just consume and throw away. We don't mend and reuse and recycle. Now we're hearing about a circular economy where we've got to get really smart about doing this. So let me end with lovely words of Wangari Maathai, which I've quoted quite a bit, but they do lift me, and I think they're words that can lift all of us. She said, "In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground." That is actually where we are in our world today, and we need the solidarity and togetherness to reach that common ground, and we're seeing some of the opposite. But we have to believe and we have to be strong in it, and I think conferences like this, talking about our wealth as the planet, as the oceans, and our ecosystem of the planet are very helpful. Thank you very much. Garmina Mahagivgara.